You don't have to listen to me for an hour, believe me. I wouldn't want to listen to Bill Wilson for an hour. An open meeting normally is supposed to give you a good cross-section, generally with a lady speaker, and to give you as much intake from different types of people as possible. Because the most important person here this morning is the person that's attending the first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And you know, I may be able to reach one type of person, and you may be able to reach another person. I had a great example of that many years ago when I went on a 12-step call. I got a call from the desk sergeant down at the police station in Lynn, and there was a guy screaming for help down there. And by now I had begun to take some of the advice I heard around Alcoholics Anonymous, and I called one of the old-timers to come with me on the 12-step call. And I went down there like gangbusters going to save this guy in the cell. And you know, no matter how I tried, this guy wasn't interested in the thing I had to say. He wasn't interested, and I couldn't reach this guy in a million years. But every word that the Doc's about, he listened with great attention. He was impressed by Doc. And it was a very good lesson to me, you know, that, you can't reach everybody. My sole purpose in being here this morning is to guarantee anybody who has been here for a while that this is an ongoing proposition. Recovery is something that if you're very fortunate, you will be doing till the day you die. I'm one of the very fortunate people that arrived at Alcoholics Anonymous absolutely hopeless and helpless, wishing to God that I had died in my sleep. And I had been like that for a long, long time before I attended Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'm one of the miracles of Alcoholics Anonymous for the simple reason I was a chronic alcoholic. I was about as bad as you could get. Nobody has ever said to me you weren't that bad. Believe me. I was that bad. I had a long, long history as an active alcoholic. I was 39 years old by the time I attended my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was an alcoholic when I was 12 years old. I was absolutely obsessed with alcohol, and I wasn't even aware of it until I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. I had been around Alcoholics Anonymous for a long, long time before I began to understand the extent of my obsession with drinking. To give you a little example, I grew up in Ireland where drinking was a national pastime. There was never any guilt about my drinking. My fondest hope was to be able to drink like my father, who had a reputation of having hollow legs, could drink all kinds of booze and could handle it. And that's what I aspired to as a kid. I was also in an ideal arrangement for an alcoholic, really, except that I cooperated 100%. I was working at a part-time job when I was 12 years old. A very common thing in Ireland is bar and grocery stores. And I was a delivery boy on a part-time basis because you couldn't work full-time until you were 14. And one of my jobs was to help in the back bottling Guinness and washing bottles. And I started sampling the Guinness. And I'll tell you, I had built up a tremendous capacity. By the time I was 14, I could almost drink my old man under the table. And I went to work full-time at this particular job. And you know, this goes back to the obsession. I had to be in a position where I could get all the booze I wanted, because I did have a tremendous capacity by now. And to give you a little example of how involved this became, I finally lost this job as a result of my drinking. And I was in a desperate situation. I had been heavily involved with the Republican movement in Ireland, and I lived for the day we would kick the king out of Ireland. And I'll tell you, I studied very hard for this. I was involved totally in the proposition that we got to get the king out of Ireland. And because of my drinking, I found myself in a situation where I had to kind of leave the country in a hurry. And I didn't have a dime to my name. I had no place to go. I was too young to go over to England doing war work, which was the only employment left for Irish people at that particular time. I mean, things were terrible in Ireland. the economy was at its lowest ever, and I was desperate. And the only out for me was to join the British Army. Now this is really something when you consider I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. I'm living for the day that we're going to kick the King out of Ireland, and I wind up in His Majesty's Royal Air Force. So you see, I mean, every move I've made in my life has been governed by my ability to drink or not to drink. Now I go into the Royal Air Force, and you know, it was one of the great experiences of my life. I spent 5 years in His Majesty's Royal Air Force all through the war, and it was a wonderful experience, believe me. I became a gung-ho airman for His Majesty, and I enjoyed my service immensely. Now the thing was, I was able to do my job, and I was able to excel at my job for years, and I left the Royal Air Force with a very good record. Now to give you a little example, now when I go into the service, you know that they didn't pay the limeys that much in the service, and I remember collecting my first 2 weeks' pay in the middle of boot camp, and I went downtown to downtown Warrington, which was a brewery town, and I figured I'd get a buzz on, and I drank my 2 weeks' pay, and I didn't get the slightest buzz, and I was broke. You know that I never drank again all the time that I lived in England, because I couldn't drink the way I wanted to. And then they sent me overseas to Cape, down in South Africa, which was a wine country where you could get all the booze you wanted. It was very reasonable, and I was back drinking again. And I drank for years. You know, the thing was, there was a period in my life when I could do all the things that normal people do and drink at the same time. It hadn't quite taken a hold of me. And I got through the service. I came out of the service, and the love of my life was waiting for me when I came home. And my big problem, the only thing that concerned me at this particular time, was not whether she loved me or I loved her. My problem was now that I had become aware of my heavy drinking, and I wondered if I could cope with it and be married at the same time. And like every form of control that I ever used, it worked for a short period of time. The hot flush of passion kept me sober for quite a while. And you know, it was incredible. But that was one of the things one of my great concerns. Now I'm married, and I'm living in London. I'm doing very well. I'm making all kinds of money. I'm in bomb damage repair work in London, which you can imagine there was plenty of it, and I was about as crooked as you could get. I was getting paid for work that wasn't even being done, and I was living the life of Riley. I was also now able to drink the way I wanted to, and it was beginning to get out of hand. I was involved with a lot of heavy drinkers in London, and it seemed to be one constant round of heavy drinking. And a sister of mine came to visit, and she offered to sponsor me out here. She figured I could do a lot better out here than I was doing in London. And you know, I had never considered ever leaving London. I was very happy there. I was making money when the Londoners weren't doing too well. I found my way around. I was in great shape. And yet and all, here was a golden opportunity for me now to get away. This was the geographical cure, the first of my geographical cure. And I left London and arrived in New York. Like most immigrants, I had one lousy dime left. After I had paid for my fare out here, in the old days, came out by boat in 1951. And by now I had a 2-year-old daughter and my wife, and of course you have to have the front. We were dressed like we just left Savile Row. I looked like $1 million, and I had one lousy dime, because my sister had told me, she didn't have a car at the time, that if she couldn't get a car, we would have to find our way down from New York. And that's what the dime was for, so I could give her a buzz in case I couldn't get home. So, you know, becoming an immigrant was just part of the scheme of things, really. wasn't my great plan. It was something that was another escape attempt to get away from alcoholism. And of course it worked for a short period of time again now. Now I come out here, I was working for minimum wage for a couple of years anyway. I couldn't seem to get started here, and I couldn't drink the way I wanted to. So the geographical cure worked for a short period of time. And then I finally got a decent job where I could drink the way I wanted to. I could live the American dream. I could buy a house. I could buy a car. And, my drinking was also increasing now. And something terrible was happening. I was having blackouts on a regular basis. And after the day that I passed papers on a new house, paid for a new car, I got bagged for drunken driving on my way home from work that day. And I had created carnage in one of the sections of Lynn. There was a guy driving a brand new Pontiac home for his wife to see, and I hit him between the two doors and demolished the car. And I bounced off several other cars. And I wound up in the jail that night. And that was the first time I began to realize why they take your belt away from you and your shoelaces when they lock you up for the night. If they had allowed me my belt, I would have made every attempt to hang myself, because it was a terrible position to be in. And I hated what was happening in my life. And I didn't know what to do about it. Now you think that this would be the thing. I was able to survive this. I started to curtail my drinking again for a short period of time. And I'll tell you one thing, it was horrendous. I went a year without a license. I was very fortunate at the time. I was working for the Ford Motor Company in Somerville. And I had to be on the line at 20 minutes to 6 in the morning. And there was no way in the world that I could make it over, get any kind of transportation to get me over there. But I was fortunate in the respect that a guy living down the street worked on the same shift as me. And for a year I traveled back and forth with him. And I swore that if I ever got my license back again, that I would never drink and drive. And I eventually did get my license back, and I was back to work, and things were happening again. And I was drinking the way I wanted to. And it was horrendous. Finally, the drinking was becoming all-consuming in my life now. I was missing work on Monday. And work was very important. That was one of my standards. This was my great loss in my life and my relationship with my family. I loved my wife dearly. I loved my kids. I would have killed for them, but I couldn't get sober for them. And when my wife pointed out to me that I was too sick to go to work on a Monday, I would assure her that, hey, listen, I'm working 2 jobs. I'm working 7 days a week. I'm working 20 hours a day. And I was doing this, I wasn't even aware of this, but I was doing this so I could drink the way I wanted to, and I could still continue, I could still keep the front. I would tell my wife, I give you my whole week's pay, I don't take a dime out of it. Whatever drinking I do is extra money that I make for myself. And I was able to justify that at one time. And then I started it's a progressive disease, and there was no way out. I didn't know this. I had reached the stage now that I couldn't live with booze and I couldn't live without it. And the next thing you know, I was missing Monday and Tuesday. And when she pointed this out to me, I went through the same routine. Defended my right to drink, told her that most people only work 5 days a week anyway. I'm still working 5 days a week, 20 hours a day. And then I got paid on a Thursday. And I started to miss Friday and Saturday. And the long story is, this didn't happen overnight. It happened so gradually that I wasn't even aware of it. The fact was that I reached the stage where I couldn't work anymore. I was desperate now. I was coming home in all kinds of states. I was afraid to come home. I hated to look at my kid's face when I come home. They would check me out to see how I was going to be. And it's a horrible expression to see on your kid's face. Complete frustration. And so now I stopped going home until they were in bed. And then I had to face my wife, who was a beautiful woman that had the patience of Job with me and pleaded with me time and time again that I was sick and I needed help. And because I could justify and rationalize to myself, not to anybody else, that it was okay for me to continue to drink. Now it became so painful for me that I couldn't go home anymore. And I done the ultimate con job on myself. I conned myself into the fact that they'd be better off without me. And I moved out of the house into the back room at the Home of the Brave, the Veterans of Foreign Wars up on Lawton Avenue in Lynn. And that's where I spent the last couple of months of my active drinking. And I tell you, it was an absolute nightmare. I would wake up out of a drunken stupor 3 times a day and not know which end was up. Always with that terrible feeling of foreboding, wishing to God that I had died in my sleep. And still having to keep that, trying desperately to keep that buzz going. Now, that's a hopeless situation, you know. I mean, I was absolutely desperate. I hated what was happening in my life, and I had absolutely no control over it. And through a set of circumstances which are too long to go into, a friend of mine approached me one Sunday morning at the bar room, and by now I smelt like an old goat. I had been living in the back room and with an electric razor, and I had stopped using the electric razor. I looked like the wrath of God. And he was a good friend of mine, and he pleaded with me. He said, you know, for old time's sake, he said, his wife's name was Margie. He said, Margie is worried sick. Will you please come home with me? He said, I'm not trying to stop you from drinking. I'll bring you right back. But for old time's sake, come on home, have a bowl of soup. So I went home with him, and there wasn't another person in the world who could have reached me but Frank. I had a lot of respect for this man. So I went home with Frank, and while I was upstairs talking to Margie, she went downstairs and called my wife and said, did you realize that you've got a very sick man on your hands and he needs help desperately? Did you ever consider Alcoholics Anonymous? And by this time, of course, my wife was almost as desperate as I was, and she said she was prepared to do anything. And they talked me into going home. And I went home. Now this has to be the grace of God, because I mean, I had no hope whatsoever. I was absolutely hopeless and helpless. But I went home, and my wife called Alcoholics Anonymous, and we were supposed to attend the meeting that night in Marblehead. And I remember going to bed and trying to sleep so I could go to the meeting. And I was in and out of the horrors all day. Every time I would lay down, and I was sleeping in my face, you know, face down, and when I'd be just about ready to doze off, somebody would grab me by the legs and start pulling me out of the bed. And I'd swing around, and when I could swing around to take a swing at them, they would disappear. And that's how I spent my afternoon, in and out of the horrors. It was a horrible way to be. And then to get ready to go to the meeting, I tried to shave, and that was a disaster. I mean, my ears were bleeding, my nose was bleeding, my eyebrows were bleeding, and I looked like I'd been dragged behind the car all the way over to Marblehead. But we did go to the meeting. And you know, this is the miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, I was about as hopeless and helpless as you could possibly be. And yet now, I learned something at that meeting. There was something about the people that night that I saw, I couldn't deny, that I wanted whatever it was they had. And I'll tell you how this program works, and when they tell you to do simple things in the program, they really serve a tremendous purpose. Like new people sit up front when they go to a meeting. And I'm sitting in the front row with a half a cup of coffee, and my wife, now in preparation for the horror show of me getting sober, because it was a horror show. Every time I tried to get sober, I would go in and out of the horrors, and I was dangerous. And in preparation for this, she had called the doctor and got a bottle of tranquilizers. And I'm sitting at the meeting, and I'm popping these tranquilizers like candy. And fortunately for me, and I mean, it just goes to show you the grace of God when I don't even know what I'm doing. A lady speaker was an open discussion, it was an open speaker meeting. And the lady speaker got up and she said, you know, if there's anybody here trying to get sober and they're taking any kind of a substance, that if they are an alcoholic and they're taking a substance to ease the pain or to gild the lily any, believe me, it will not work. You will abuse it exactly the same as you abuse alcohol. And for some reason or other, I'll never know. I mean, I had no experience of substitutes at the time. I had never seen the effect of substitutes on other people. This was in 1963, for God's sake. They weren't that prevalent. But I threw the pills away when I went home that night, and I'll be eternally grateful for that woman. And I was able to get sober from that day on. I never found it necessary to go back out there again. My research was all done. Was I happy at the prospect of being sober now that I had found a way out? Absolutely not. The gloomiest proposition I ever had to face, you know, I could handle when they told me, you only got to do it for one day. And then after about a month of this, I began to realize that, hey, they were conning me. They were taking my bottle away from me. They told me I could never drink again in safety. And I knew this from practical experience. I knew there was no control left to my drinking. And when they would describe the disease of alcoholism, they would talk about the physical thing, which was something that I never needed anybody to explain to me. They said there was something different about alcoholics, that when they put alcohol into their system, they created this phenomenon of craving, which they called compulsive. And from there on in, you had absolutely no control. Now, I could understand this because I was well aware of compulsion long before I ever came to Alcoholics Anonymous. Now I had a name for it. They also told me that if you had this compulsion, that it would be with you till the day you died, that you would never again be able to drink in safety. Even if you drink, you couldn't drink. And that the only hope you had for any kind of a life at all was total abstinence. Now this was where the real gloom came in. I mean, how in the name of God, I was 39 years old, I spent my whole life in the bar room. I would drink with people. Everybody I knew drank the same as I did. How in the name of God could I ever have any more fun? I mean, I was only 39 years old. If I lived to be 80, that meant I had about 40 years of misery to look forward to. And this is where desperation is a lifesaver, really. I mean, I had a terrible record. And, you know, I didn't want to go back to where I came from. And they told me that if I was an alcoholic, that whether I was drinking or not, the disease would progress within me. And that if it was bad now, if I was back out there again, it would be worse. And you know something? If they guaranteed me that I would have died if I picked up a drink, I would have picked up a drink gladly. But I was terribly afraid I was going to go back to that never land. The land of the living dead out there, when you're neither fish nor flesh, when you can't live with booze and you can't live without it. But they had told me in the early days, you're going to be sober for the next 36 years. I would have gone right out the other door. I didn't want any part of that. I did have enough gray matter to understand that my only hope for survival was Alcoholics Anonymous. And that if I did exactly, now I was going to an awful lot of meetings and I was subjecting myself to the power of example. There was people from every walk of life staying sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had enough gray matter to understand that if I did exactly what I was told, that I could get sober, I could stay sober, and I could have a kind of a good life, because every time I stopped drinking, I loved my wife and I loved my kids. I was a devoted family person when I was sober. And I was prepared to settle for that. I figured, I'll go to these meetings. I'll never smile again. I'll attend these meetings like a penance for the day I die. But at least I'll be sober. And you know, I'll be eternally grateful for that I was prepared to settle for that. And then I done everything right, really, for a new alcoholic. I had become a member of an active group, which was one of the best things I could have possibly done for myself. That was a good pull in my case. It was a case of not being able to say no when the secretary asked me to join. I also acquired a sponsor, which was to be my lifesaver. This guy was absolutely tailor-made for me. And he was a tremendous power of example. Now, he was only sober about a year longer than me, and he lost a young son to leukemia, and he was able to grieve in dignity, and he was able to be there for his family. And this guy was the same kind of a brawler that I was. I mean, he was a two-fisted drunk, and he was able to stay sober. He was a tremendous power of example. Now, when I was sober for almost a year, I'm going on commitments. I was a member, very active member of this group. I'm going on commitments, and I'm talking to people and telling them how I feel. And I'm coming back from a meeting one night with Leo, who was my sponsor. And I said, Leo, I feel like a hypocrite, really. I want to drink. I'm telling everybody how wonderful it is to be sober, because believe me, it was wonderful. I could find my car every morning. I didn't have to go downtown looking for it. I was back in the big bed. I was working again and providing for my family. A lot of the kids were beginning to treat me like a human being again. And you know, I wanted to drink so bad I could taste it. And I said to Leo, I feel like a hypocrite. I'm telling everybody how great it is that I want to drink so bad I can taste it. And he said, hey buddy, he said, I know exactly how you feel. He said, the kindest words I ever heard in Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, I used to feel just like you when I first came to Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, that's what they mean by the insanity in the second step. That insanity that precedes getting up the first drink. He said, here you are for the first time in your life, you're sober a year, a lot of good things are happening to you, and he said, this is what they mean by the insanity, for no reason in the world. I mean, only an insane person would pick up a drink after your record. So I said, the thing is, it doesn't have to be that way. He said, there is a recovery program, and the sooner you get into it, the better. And of course, he had to explain to me what the recovery program was, and he laid out a set of ground rules for me to follow. He made me go through my litany of my day. And I told him, well, I get up in the morning and I ask God for help. I don't believe in God, but I ask God for help anyway because it's part of Alcoholics Anonymous. I go to a meeting, I go on commitments, I'm a member of my group. I'm going to meetings on a regular basis. And he said, when you ask God for help in the morning, what do you ask for? I said, what they told me. Please God, help me a drunk to get through the day without a drink. He said, it must appear even to you that it's worth it. He said, it's the only person you're asking. For the first time in your life, you're sober for a year. He said, doesn't it seem logical that if you ask this guy to help you to remove this terrible obsession to drink, that maybe he might do that too? But he won't do it by himself. Unless you cooperate with him and do the legwork, you might as well be wasting your time. He suggested that I start praying for pigeons, that I double up on all my commitments, that I read the 12 steps of recovery with a little bit of comprehension for change. And I started to do all these things. You know, God has a sense of humor. I had pigeons coming from every direction. By the time I got done with the pigeons, believe me, I was beginning to understand what Leo was talking about. I was beginning to understand because a lot of those pigeons died as a result of going out for one more try. And I began to understand that I was one of the chosen people in Alcoholics Anonymous, that I was allowed to get sober and stay sober. And lo and behold, as a result of doing the things that Leo told me, I woke up one morning and I knew deep down in my soul that I never had to drink again, provided that I continue to practice this program to the best of my ability. I also had another great power of example in my life. This was another member of my group. When I read in the big book, now the big book had become my gospel. I mean, it was my handbook for staying sober. How can you argue with anything in the big book? It's to combine the experiences of the first 100 drunks and the things they found they had to do to get sober and to stay sober. And I was read in the big book that you had to recover spiritually. Now, even though I'm sober for well over a year now, I still didn't believe in God. I had absolutely no conception of God whatsoever. And now I'm desperate because it says in the big book that you have to recover spiritually first to make this program. And now I wanted to stay sober. Now, because I was new and didn't know that much, I confused God and religion and spirituality was religion, and I decided I'd go back to the church I'd grown up in. And I was bored to tears. Honest to God, it was terrible. I didn't find anything there at all. Now this is the amazing thing. It shows you the willingness that I was prepared to go to get sober. It was heresy for a native Irishman to go to anybody else but the Pope for help. But I went to the Seventh-day Adventists. I was doing a job for the Seventh-day Adventists, and I found them to be very honorable and trustworthy people. And I went to the head guy and I told him that I was looking for God. And he took me back to the headquarters that night and gave me the spiel and sent me home with the John Smith book there. And he told me that I didn't need Alcoholics Anonymous. That all I had to do was to put my faith in God and to read that big book. So I took the book home. Fortunately for me, I was staying in a motel and I had time. I had no place else to go. And I read it. And you know, they had changed the language a little bit. They didn't talk about fire and brimstone anymore. They talked about hydrogen holocaust. And they'd give you examples of how close we came to a hydrogen holocaust. And if you didn't repent, you were going to burn in hell the day you died. And I took that book and I threw it through the window. And I came back to my group with my tail between my legs. And because I got to know the people in my group, I went to see Howie, who was a member of my group, and if I was ever guilty of putting any person on the pedestal, it was this guy. And I went to Howie and I told him, Howie, I'm in serious trouble. I'm looking for God and I can't find him. So I told him what I had done. And he said, for God's sake, he said, you're looking in all the wrong places. He said, God is in people like Leo, who will leave a warm bed with something nice beside him and go on a 12-step call at 2 o'clock in the morning. He said, by your own admission, he said, you have made remarkable spiritual recovery. It's because I was talking and I was letting people know where I came from. He said, for one thing, let me ask you, he said, you remember before you came to Alcoholics Anonymous how you wanted to die, you wished to God that you had died every morning? He said, have you felt like that since you got sober? I hadn't. He said, have you had to lie or cheat for a drink since you came to Alcoholics Anonymous? And I hadn't. He said, the biggest single spiritual recovery you made in a lifetime, he said, you wouldn't be here today if you hadn't, was the days when you came home from your last drunk and your wife said to you, for God's sake, now don't you realize you're sick and you need help? And I was able to answer yes, for the first time in my life. I was halfway home then and I didn't know it. I had taken the first step before I ever attended my first meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so Howie was great for me. Now Howie, nobody could put AA across like this guy. He could have you crying one minute and laughing the next. He was a wonderful power of example. Nobody knew the program like he did. Nobody could put the recovery program across like he did. And he became complacent and picked up a drink as a result of fooling around with substitutes. And Howie was never able to get sober. And for about 4 years he bounced in and out, and it was absolutely terrible to watch, this wonderful man. And finally, in desperation, he went in. Now he had everything to live for, like I had at one time. He had a beautiful home in Marblehead. He had a big Cadillac that he was driving. He had a very important job down at GE. And he got up one morning, got in his car in the garage, didn't bother opening the door, and started the car up. And that's how they found him. How he just couldn't face it. And there was another tremendous power of example for me. How he, with all his knowledge, had become complacent and died as a result of it. And the message to me was, if a smart guy like Howie can become complacent, a dumb guy, I knew my limitations, believe me. A guy like me would have to play it very simply, keep it very close to the bone, that I would have to live by the basics of Alcoholics Anonymous. And fortunately for me, I've been able to do that. There was another great power of example. As a result of being a member of my group, I was able to live on the experiences of everybody in that group. And long before I had any faith that this was going to work for me, I'd seen people in that group stay sober in every condition in the book. The children dying, divorces, people dying from terrible diseases, and they were staying sober and seemed to be growing in leaps and bounds. So I had a great power of example going for me. Now the amazing thing about it, I went through a period of about 15 years when everything was happening good in my life. This good job that I had in GE allowed me to not GE, but the Ford Motor Company, allowed me to live like a human being. I was able to live the good life. I was skiing up country all winter long. I was playing golf in Hilton Head when it was too cold to ski. I mean, it was an incredible lifestyle. And for about 15 years I was running around telling everybody how sweet it is, that it was great to be sober. Everywhere I went to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'd be eternally grateful for that, because everywhere I went, as a result of, I'll give you one little example. I was down in Aspen for a week, which is any skier's paradise. Powder up your belly button every day, the sun shining, it was absolutely beautiful. And the highlight of that whole week for me was attending a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous that night in somebody's house in Aspen, because the hall was busy that night. And it was the first time I was ever at a meeting where everybody held hands at the sight of the Lord's Prayer. And it was the most tremendous experience I've ever had. It made my whole vacation. I would see the cop directing traffic, he was at the meeting. I would go into a store and I'd see one of the assistants in the store was at the meeting. And it was great. And I went like that for many, many years. And thank God I never forgot where I came from. I shared this at every meeting I went to. And then, of course, life being what it is, I got the other end of the stick. And I went through a period where everything disastrous that could possibly happen to a human being happened to me. That beautiful woman that had so much patience, that had so much compassion, even when I was at my worst, was given a death sentence with cancer. They gave her 3 months to live. And that was an incredible experience, for the simple reason that she survived a year. I was able to take her back to Ireland, where she said goodbye to all her family and her friends, and it was the best year of my life, the happiest and saddest. There wasn't one word that went and said between us. It was a tremendous loss. And I could cry myself to sleep at night at the prospect of losing this beautiful woman. I'd known her since she was 12 years old, for God's sake. I could cry myself to sleep and say, I thank you, God, for allowing me to be sober, to be here, to do the things that normal people take for granted. But for me as an alcoholic, it was a privilege to be able to be there for her. And it was a tremendous experience. I was able to survive that. And that wasn't the worst thing that happened in my life. I had a grandson that was one of the finest people that I ever met in my life. He was 2 years old when he was infected with AIDS as a result of tainted blood. And he died when he was 2 weeks short of 16. And this kid had more compassion, more character, more integrity than anybody I ever knew. And I was able to be there for him. The unit lady, he's a guy now that had neglected his own family, and his kids were afraid and ashamed. And I'm able to be there for my grandson. Him and I played golf together. We skied together. When the disease started to take his toll, he was becoming to lose his faculties, I was able to be with him. I was able to take him for walks down the beach. We played golf right up to the last. The last time we played golf, we played 5 holes. And the poor kid was losing his coordination now. He was taking 5 or 6 swipes at the ball every time, and it was breaking his heart. And after the 5th hole, He went behind a tree to release himself, and he said, "Pa, I'm urinating blood. I have to go home to be infused." So that was the end of the golf. Then I started taking him because by now he knew he was terminal. He'd known he had been terminal from the time he was 8 years old. I learned more from this kid than I did from anybody in the world. And now that we couldn't go golfing anymore, we'd go down the beach because he had become totally dependent upon his mother. She would go to the bathroom and be standing outside the door waiting for her when she came out. So it was important that I would take him down the beach walking and get him away from her for a couple of hours, give her a break, give him a break. And he got to the stage that he couldn't walk anymore, and we started going to the movies. And I would take him to the movies, and would get him out of the house for 3 or 4 hours. And finally, he would get up to go to the bathroom and couldn't find his way back to the seat. And he would fall asleep the minute we went in, so I couldn't take him to the movies anymore. And I was able to be there for him all the way down the line. I was able to give him the Serenity Prayer, and I never knew anybody in Alcoholics Anonymous that used the Serenity Prayer as well as this kid did. Never once did he say, "Why me, Pa?" He was a wonderful kid. And I was able to be there for him, all as a result of being sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, was I doing this graciously? Absolutely not. He was in Children's Hospital, and he was in the last legs of his life. He was suffering the tortures of hell. And I went in to visit him one day. He was all scrunched. He couldn't hold his head up anymore, and he couldn't sit up without help. And he was propped up in a wheelchair, and he had been sick all over himself. And I went into the room, and I was absolutely incensed. I wanted to kill somebody for neglecting this kid like this. And I heard the nurse coming out of the bathroom in the room. And she said that she was taking him down for an MRI, and he threw up all over him, so she had to bring him back. And I was horrified to think of this beautiful, kind, and gentle kid with so much character had to suffer so badly. So I don't go to church anymore. I go down the beach. And I go down the beach and I'm screaming at God, "You son of a bitch. Look at what you're doing to this beautiful kid. What did he ever do to deserve?" And I'm screaming at him. And this went on all night long. And finally, I survived the night. I went in to see him the following morning, and he's sitting up in bed. "Hi, Pa." And I was horrified. I think, here I am ready to bury this beautiful kid, and he's in there struggling. So I visited with him for a while, and I went back down the beach. And this is because I was doing the 10th step and the 11th step. I said, "God, please show me. I'm sorry I tried to tell you your business yesterday, but for God's sake, I'm only human, and you have to help me, and you have to show me. Help me to accept. I will never try to tell you your business again." And I was able to accept the loss of this beautiful child. And he still lives with me. He's everywhere. And when I've had some real tough times, and I was able to stay sober. And every now and then, when everything is backed in and I'm backed into a corner and I don't know which way to turn, I ask myself, how would Christopher handle this situation? Let go and let God. And that's exactly what I've been able to do. I've survived all these years, and believe it or not, the only reason I'm here is because of Alcoholics Anonymous. If I got what I deserved, I should have died in a doorway. I should have died in a barroom brawl. I should have died in my own puke. I was that hopeless and helpless. And here I am. Just about every day this week I ski. Isn't that amazing? I love coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. If there is anybody in this room that I might help today to hang in, I'm here to tell people like Mama, to celebrate 20 years of sobriety, that it gets better. It continues to get better. There is still recovery to be made. As long as you live, as long as you're alive, if you're an alcoholic, and you practice this beautiful, simple program, the rewards are absolutely endless. I've been able to survive some terrible situations in my life. And all because of Alcoholics Anonymous and people like you. So my advice to somebody brand new coming in, you wonder, what the hell am I doing here? What did I get myself into now? Maybe I was a buoy alarm. That's where I started out. Believe it or not. With such a terrible record as I had, I still had all the reservations that a new drug had. But because I came to Alcoholics Anonymous and I became an observer, I was able to get sober. I was able to stay sober, and my life got better. And that's the guarantee I give anybody who is sitting here this morning. If you've reached a stage, another phrase I never needed to have explained to me, if you're sick and tired of being sick and tired and you're looking for a way out, come along with us and let a lot of good things happen to you. You can get sober, you can stay sober, your life will get better as a result. You can also come in here and sit on your dead ass for the next 20 years if you don't do the legwork. There are no free dinners, even in Alcoholics Anonymous. If you want what we have, you're going to have to do what we do together. If anybody new, please come back to another meeting. Don't be discouraged by what I had to say this morning. There's always a bright side to everything. Well, for a guy that wanted to listen to Bill Wilson for an hour, you have to put up and Okay, I give the meeting back to my beautiful friend here. Thank you.